I'm a 52-year-old widower who took early retirement last year due to medical issues. I was thrilled at first with my sudden freedom from a job I had always hated. But it didn't take long for the novelty to wear off, and I soon became bored with my excess leisure time. I didn't have much of a social life, no real friends, and my wife and I had been childless. I decided to take up a hobby to keep my mind occupied. Most guys my age will take up golfing or fishing or whatever, but none of those things had ever had any appeal to me. Then I had a brainstorm. When I was 12, I'd gone through a phase where I was obsessed with metal detecting. I couldn't tell you what got me started, probably something I saw on TV or some book I read about buried treasure. All I know is I decided I had to have a metal detector of my own. Finally, after much pestering, my parents broke down and bought me the cheapest model they could find at Radio Shack. I can still fondly remember how thrilled I was, and all the hours I spent scanning our backyard with my new toy, convinced I was going to uncover some incredible treasure. A cache of gold coins buried by some Wild West outlaw or some 18th century pirate's long-lost loot. Yeah, in retrospect, I suppose my expectations were a tad unrealistic, especially since I grew up in suburban Ohio. Needless to say, I never did uncover anything particularly amazing. Old junk metal, pull tabs, nails, and a few modern coins. As with most childhood interests, I eventually grew out of my metal detecting / treasure hunting phase. The detector went into my closet to gather dust, and I moved on to other pursuits. But now, 40 years later on, being a single middle-aged man with a surplus of downtime and nothing much to do with it, my old interest in metal detecting was re-sparked, especially after watching some videos on the more popular YouTube channels dedicated to the hobby and seeing what others had discovered buried just below the surface. Old coins, colonial relics, expensive jewelry, etc. My old Radio Shack detector was long gone, but there was nothing stopping me from buying a new, more high-tech one, and that's just what I did. After doing some research online for a model that fit both my needs and budget, I decided on a Garrett Ace Apex due to its high rating. A good, reasonably priced, multi-frequency unit with plenty of features that made it versatile and easy to use for both beginners and seasoned pros alike. I also invested some money in a small treasure hunting kit, a short digging tool that resembled a cross between a gardening trowel and a knife, a metal probe for locating targets below the surface, a battery-powered wand-like device that was essentially a mini detector used for pinpointing small metallic objects in a hole, and a pouch to store my finds, all of which could be worn on a belt. After my new detector arrived, I took some time familiarizing myself with it, reading the instruction manual and testing it indoors to get a feel for its various functions. I learned how to optimize its settings for the best results on different types of terrain and when searching for different types of buried objects. I learned how to identify different kinds of metal based on the tones the unit would emit when I passed the coil over them, and how to differentiate between ferrous and non-ferrous metals. I learned how to determine exactly where a buried object would be located beneath the coil. Sorry if I'm getting a little too technical for you guys, but I thought it might be worth explaining for those who aren't familiar with metal detecting. When I felt I was comfortable with my new machine, my next step was to try it outside in my yard. It was the same story as when I had been 12. Some newer coins, a couple pieces of cheap costume jewelry, and a lot of junk. My house is in a subdivision that was developed in the late 1970s, so it wasn't likely I was going to find anything particularly old there. I needed to try some older places to make more interesting finds. The town park dates back to the late 1800s, so I went there first. Unfortunately, I wasn't the only metal detectorist who'd thought of it, and the place had been already pretty well picked clean. I did find a 1941 mercury dime and a couple of wheat pennies from the 50s, which was pretty cool. There are some older homes in my neighborhood that would have been perfect. I asked the homeowners for permission, but perhaps unsurprisingly, a lot of people are rather leery of having a middle-aged stranger digging holes in their yards, even with the promise I would share half of whatever I found with them. I did some research into the history of my area, trying to find some good places to detect. Unfortunately, my town has been pretty extensively modernized and redeveloped, so besides the park, there weren't many public places predating the second half of the last century. I figured I wouldn't have much luck detecting locally, so I started getting into the habit of driving out of town and surveying the neighboring communities, looking for places that might go back to the turn of the last century, old parks, playgrounds, etc. I finally hit pay dirt in the front lawn of an old, long-abandoned church and found my first significantly old coin, a 1904 barber quarter. It was pretty worn and not in great shape, but it was still thrilling to hold something that had probably been in the ground for over 100 years. Awe-inspiring to know mine was the first hand to hold it since then, and rather humbling to realize that not only was the last person to hold it long dead, but also everyone who had been alive in the world at that time. I've found some other old coins since then, and also some interesting relics, horseshoes, old brass padlocks, hand-forged square-head nails, skeleton keys, etc. But the last time I went detecting 5 months ago, something disturbing happened, something that soured the hobby for me, something that made my blood run cold, something that still scares me when I think about it. It was late June, right after the start of summer, a gorgeous sunny day, not too hot, and with a pleasant breeze in the air. I was in my car on one of my usual tours, trying to scout out some new untouched places. I was in a fairly rural area about a half-hour's drive north of my town. Farmland for the most part. There were a few homes and barns here and there, an occasional gas station, 1 or 2 silos, but mostly just corn and wheat fields stretching for as far as the eye could see. I was actually on my way into the next town to look for some historic places to detect and was just enjoying the passing scenery, but as I drove by a house on my right, I slowed down and took a closer look. It was a ramshackle 2-story farmhouse, very run down and dilapidated. The front lawn was heavily overgrown. A badly rusted Chevy pickup was sitting on 4 flat rotted tires in the long weed-infested gravel driveway. It looked like it had been abandoned for quite some time. This gave me an idea. The house looked like it was at least 100 years old. If the place really was abandoned, this was an ideal opportunity to do some treasure hunting. No hassling with suspicious homeowners for permission. I was in the middle of nowhere, so there wouldn't be any nosy neighbors either. This place could be a gold mine for old coins and relics. I backed up and turned into the driveway and pulled up right behind the pickup. I shut off the engine, got out, and went up the porch to knock and make sure there wasn't anyone living there. Sure enough, the front door had been boarded shut, and upon closer inspection, I noticed several of the windows were broken. I looked out over the front lawn. It looked like it was at least an acre. Jackpot. Not wasting a moment, I got my gear out of my car and started scanning the yard. Visions of Indian head pennies, buffalo nickels, and Morgan silver dollars dancing in my head. I got a mid-tone signal right away and got down on my knees with my digging tool, eagerly cutting a round plug out of the grass directly over where I'd heard the beep. After a minute or so, I held my prize up to the light, an old Budweiser bottle cap. But I wasn't discouraged. I still had plenty of daylight and most of the yard to detect. But 3 hours later, with 30 or so holes dotting the ground and nothing to show for my efforts but a handful of junk and no particularly interesting finds, I was starting to feel a bit discouraged. It was going on 3, I hadn't thought to bring along a lunch, and I was starting to get hungry. I decided to move around the house and give the backyard a try. I would dig a few targets, and if I didn't uncover something good, I'd pack up and call it a day. The backyard was a lot bigger than the front, about 3 acres sprawling to the edge of a cornfield in the rear of the property. There was a rotted tool shed with a partially collapsed roof off to one side, a tall oak tree off to the other, and between them, more or less in the center of the yard, stood an old brick barbecue pit. I gave the perimeter of the shed a few cursory sweeps with my detector, but the few signals I picked up didn't read very high, probably old screws and nails. Next, I circled the barbecue pit, sweeping the search coil over the weedy soil. Almost immediately, I got a high, shrill tone. The readout on my monitor said it was in the high 90s, the range for very promising targets, possibly even gold. It was only a couple inches deep. Excitedly, I dropped down to my knees, cut a plug out of the earth above the target, and turned it over. Something twinkled with a golden gleam at the bottom of the hole. I felt my heart jump in my chest. I plucked the object from the hole and held it up for a close inspection. For a second, I was confused. Confusion gave way to horror, and disgust quickly followed after. It was a tooth, a human molar with a gold filling in the crown. Repulsed, I threw it away and hurriedly wiped my hand off on my jeans. I sat there for a moment, disturbed, then shrugged it off with a slightly shaky laugh. Whoever had once lived here obviously hadn't practiced good dental hygiene. I looked at the time and saw it was getting close to 4 p.m. I decided on one more target and then I'd head home. I approached the oak tree, and after a couple minutes I picked up another high signal. The target ID said it was big. Silver dollar size, maybe. But more likely probably an old soup can, I told myself, trying not to get my hopes up. Whatever it was pretty deep, 6 to 8 inches. I got down and began to excavate the signal. It was difficult to dig. This close to the tree, there were several big roots in the way. I had to stop and use the serrated edge of my hand digger to cut through them. It took me about 10 minutes, but finally I figured I was at the correct depth. I felt through the loose dirt with my fingers, but couldn't feel anything. I took out my mini detector and probed the soil to pinpoint my find. It began to beep. I dug down about another inch, and there it was, a flat, corroded metal surface. Obviously not an old coin, but it could still be a neat relic. Maybe an old farming tool or something. I wiped the dirt away and saw it was circular and about 5 inches in diameter. Maybe it really is an old can, I thought to myself with an ironic smirk. I gripped a hold of it and tried to wiggle it free, but it was lodged firmly into the ground. It didn't feel like a discarded tin can. It was too solidly fixed in place. Intrigued, I used my digger to scrape out more dirt around the metal circle. Beneath it, I saw the glint of glass. It wasn't a can, it was a jar of some kind. My excitement was reignited. I remembered hearing how in the old days country folk used to hide their money on their land because they didn't trust banks. Maybe I just stumbled upon some long-gone farmer's life savings. I carefully unearthed the jar, bringing more of it into view. It was an old mason jar, all right, and a damn big one from the look of it. Maybe a full gallon sized. I worked it back and forth with my hands, slowly loosening it from the earth that had kept it hidden for God only knew how long. Finally, I pried it free. It was heavy. There was something in it. I wiped the dirt off the sides and peered in. The jar was full of bundles of what looked like paper packets. I'm rich. A thrilled voice screamed in my mind. I attempted to twist the rusted lid off the jar, but it was stuck on tight. I had to take out my pocket knife and use the blade tip to loosen the edge of the lid from the rim of the jar. Eventually, I got it off and peered eagerly into the jar, and once again was crushed with bitter disappointment. Not wads of cash, but bundles of old photographs bound together with rubber bands. Dejected, but still slightly intrigued, I took one out to examine it, wondering if I had found some kind of time capsule. There were about 30 pictures in the packet. Old faded black and white Kodaks. I sifted through them, at first only mildly curious. The first couple pictures were of a suburban ranch-style house seen from a distance. There was a vintage early to mid-1960s car parked in the driveway. The pictures had been taken during the day. There were no people visible in the photos. I flipped through the next 3 or 4 pictures, furrowing my brow with puzzlement. They depicted the same house, only now at nighttime. All the windows were dark and only the porch light was on. I flipped to the next one. I stared at it, beginning to feel slightly uneasy. It was a photograph of the front door of the same house, taken much closer than the previous ones. I turned it aside to the next picture. It was a shot of the interior of a house, presumably the same house from the earlier pictures. It was view of a dark hallway, illuminated only by what I assume had been the camera's flashbulb. Feeling increasingly unsettled, I flipped it over to the next photo. It depicted a dark bedroom. Two figures could be seen lying under blankets on a double bed. Feeling cold, with fingers that were beginning to tremble, I turned hesitantly to the next picture. It was the same bed, but a closer view. Close enough for the figures to be clearly distinguishable. A man and a woman who looked to be in their early 30s, both of them asleep. The unknown photographer must have been standing right beside them when the picture was taken. I flipped to the next picture. The same couple in bed. The picture had been taken at the same distance and angle as the one before it, but now the woman was awake, looking up with groggy confusion in the direction of the camera, her face illuminated by the flash. I should have stopped right then. I wish I had, but I didn't. As scared as I was, I also felt perversely compelled by a morbid curiosity to keep going. I turned to the next picture. I emitted a sound I can't really describe, something that was somehow both a choked scream and yet also a gasp, a simultaneous expulsion inhalation of shocked, horrified air. A mutilated figure lay upon the rumpled, blood-stained bedsheets, so badly disfigured its sex was unidentifiable, just a mass of mangled, dismembered flesh, bone, hair, and exposed organs glistening wetly in the camera flash. I don't recall consciously shuffling through the remaining pictures in the packet. My brain had gone numb with shock, and yet my hands must have continued to sort through them automatically because the remaining images are forever imprinted in my memory. A picture of a farmhouse I recognized as being the same one I was presently crouching behind, albeit less aged and decrepit. Pictures of some dingy, indistinct location that might have been a basement or a barn or a shack. A workbench cluttered with an untidy assortment of bladed instruments ranging from knives to saws to hatchets, all of them dirty and specked with rust, or maybe bloodstains. Pictures of the woman from the bedroom, bound to a chair in the same location, nude, a gag in her mouth, her terrified face looking up at her unseen tormentor, pleading, fearful eyes moist with tears. Pictures of unspeakable torture and mayhem. Pictures of dismembered body parts hanging from hooks like butchered animals in a slaughterhouse. And then, at last, the final picture. A picture that by itself would have seemed perfectly innocuous and nondescript after the grisly carnage that preceded it. Slabs of anonymous meat roasting on a grill. A man's hands in the foreground, tending to them with a pair of tongs. A cookout. I stared at it for what seemed like a long time, breathing unevenly, tears trickling down my cheeks. I looked at the large glass jar with similar packets of photographs at the bottom. It looked like there were at least 24 more. I looked up with dawning comprehension and turned my gaze to the crumbling brick barbecue pit in the center of the backyard. I staggered to my feet in a daze, moving almost robotically to the barbecue pit. I peered down into it. At the bottom was a heap of old, weed-infested ashes. I reached down and pushed one hand into the ashes, sifting through them, digging deeper, until my probing fingers encountered something hard. I grasped the object and retrieved it from the pit, holding it up into the late afternoon sunlight, a charred human jawbone. I dropped it, then lost control of my heaving stomach. I fell to my knees and vomited. Then I just crouched there, weeping. Then I got out my phone and dialed 911. That was the last time I ever metal detected. The police came and did an investigation, and eventually the FBI also got involved. Apparently, the farmhouse had been deserted for over 15 years, ever since its previous owner, an elderly farmer who had apparently been a loner and something of a recluse, had died of natural causes. He had been a Korean War veteran and had no criminal history, a lifelong bachelor who had, by all outward appearances, led a normal, peaceful existence. With no close living relatives, the property had been abandoned. A makeshift darkroom was found in the basement, since obviously it wouldn't have been possible for the photographs to be processed by a commercial developer. So far, authorities have been able to identify 8 local missing persons, the oldest dating back to 1966 using the pictures, and thus close the books on 8 cold cases. But there are at least 20 more they have yet to solve. But that's not the worst part. You see, not all of the photographs in that jar were old black and whites. Some were Polaroids of the type that develop automatically, and the newest ones were color Kodaks, the kind you get in a disposable camera you can buy in a drugstore. The most recent case the police have solved was that of a teenage girl who disappeared just 10 years ago, after the old man was already dead. The last picture in the single packet I looked through had clearly been taken by someone else. The man tending the barbecue had both hands in frame. Someone else was involved, someone who hasn't been identified, someone who is still out there,